Now. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll just get underway with the session on green trade. We've just had a presentation from Carsten Steinfart and also Alice Tipping looking at the whole issues of green trade and sustainability. That was pre-recorded. We're now here, we'll have a keynote from James Shaw, the Minister for Climate Change, and the respondents to that, Professor Frank Scimgeour from the University of Waikato and Associate Professor Maureen Benson-Rea from the University of Auckland, who will each give a perspective on the prior presentations, put it in some New Zealand context, and also pose a question to the Minister. Just introducing James Shaw, prior to becoming an MP, he had a very successful career in management consulting in London. He returned back to New Zealand, became an MP, firstly joining the Green Party. He came into government in 2017 as Greens co-leader and was appointed the Minister for Climate Change, Statistics and Associate Minister of Finance. James guided the Zero Carbon Act through Parliament and managed to achieve unanimous support across the House. He reformed the emissions trading scheme to cut pollution into the atmosphere and established Green Finance Limited, which is starting to make an impact now in the investing framework. Back now in his second term, again as Minister of Climate Change, he's focused on specific measures to reduce greenhouse emissions in transport, energy and agriculture sectors, and of course coming up some major confrontation, I guess, from the Climate Change Commission on just what some of those big transformations would make and mean for New Zealand and New Zealand business. I just found it quite interesting just listening to our first presenter talking, Carsten Steinfart, kind of taking you back to that period of the Club of Rome and the Limits to Growth publication in the 1970s, which of course energised a range of activists in New Zealand at that time who formed the Values Party, which was an antecedent to what is now the Green Party of today. Today, that debate of trade or environment has moved on, and it's now trade and environment, as Carsten reminded us. Floor over to you, Minister.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, and I'll get into the either or debate in a minute. I just want to preface this by saying this is not, what I'm about to say is not official New Zealand trade policy. You had that from Damien yesterday. That gives me the ability to talk in slightly more general terms about some of the things that may be coming up on the horizon and some of the areas where we may or may not end up playing in. But there will be, I will talk about some of the specific things that we are doing there as well. Trade isn't my beat. Climate change is my beat. But the thing about climate change is, you may not be interested in climate change, but climate change is interested in you. So it means that I'm sticking my nose into trade and transport and agriculture and energy and housing and building and construction and pretty much every portfolio you can imagine. Because that is at the stage that we are at now, which is to say, having gone from what was largely an international framework without much domestic application to having to think through what is the domestic application in terms of our own legal frameworks and institutions, now to kind of rolling it out across every part of our society and our economy. And we end up here with trade. And I'm sticking my nose into trade quite a lot at the moment because we are not going to be able to get where we need to go without focusing on trade. When you think about it, it's kind of a classic trade issue. We're not very good at making electric cars here in Aotearoa. We're actually not very good at making any cars at all. Other people are. We are quite good at some of the lowest emissions intensity in agricultural systems. As other countries start to get to grips with their own methane and nitrous oxide challenges, having tackled some of their carbon dioxide challenges, we may have something to offer to the world there in exchange for about 4.5 million second-hand right-hand drive electric cars, which is what we're currently in the market for, if anybody's got any ideas. Now, of course, climate change has been dealt with through the multilateral system rather, in the UNFCCC rather than through trade up until now. And I have to say, it's not going very well. I say this because if you consider all of the greenhouse gas emissions that humanity has put into the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution 250 odd years ago, 50% of all of those greenhouse gases that we've put into the atmosphere, we have put into the atmosphere since 1990, which was the year that we decided to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So the trend to date for the multilateral system has not been terribly affected. Now, it might have been more if we hadn't done, if we didn't have those kind of frameworks, but frankly, progress has actually been going backwards rather than forwards. Now, there are some really encouraging signs, particularly in recent months, actually, that countries are starting to take the challenge seriously and to engage in the kind of huge efforts that are actually required to not just arrest the increase, but to actually start to draw down some of the stock of gases that we've already put into the atmosphere. And that's really what brings us to trade, because there are a number of trends there, not least of which is the need for us to work with each other through trade mechanisms in order for every country to be able to make any kind of progress at all. But you're starting to see hints of countries starting to accrue trade advantage based on how strong they are in terms of their domestic climate action, or trade disadvantage for those that are kind of dragging the chain. There's some recent examples of this. The European Union, maybe a year or 18 months ago or so, said that they would not do any free trade deals at all with any country that was not a member of the Paris Agreement. Of course, coincidentally, that announcement came about a month after one country signaled it was going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, the United States. And of course, the incoming Biden administration is signaling that they, of course, will then reverse that and bring them back in. So look forward to an EU-US trade deal someday. The other one is that you're starting to see, some of the arrangements. I mean, Brazil was subject to some pretty strong questioning in terms of its trade relationship with the EU as well, because Brazil is one of those countries that has been kind of holding up the multilateral process more recently, and that hasn't turned into anything specific yet. But there are some kind of signals there that Brazil may find it hard to get its exports into the European Union if it continues to drag the chain and to hold up progress on some of those key agreements. So that has implications for us, and I'll get to that in a minute. But one thing I wanted to cover off first is around trade advantage and some of the things that we're doing around this. So some of you in the room will have heard of the nascent agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability. This was an initiative of our own trade desk at MFAT, where what we're trying to do is not just ensure that we have a trade agreement which is not inconsistent with our environmental commitments, which is a low bar, but a bar we mostly haven't reached yet, but to actually say, well, can we construct something where we work with other countries to build a trade agreement around environmental outcomes, right? So to actually accelerate environmental outcomes rather than just try and ensure some level of consistency between what we want to do in the environment on the one hand and what we want to do with trade on the other, which is, to your point, Fran, I think where the argument used to be was that we had we had environmental agreements on one hand and trade agreements on the other, and pulling away from each other, which I think is where that perception built up, that there was, actually that, trade deals were bad for the environment. Now we're trying to bring those things together. So the agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability has kind of, a few key elements to it. First of all is to liberalize trade in environmental goods and services. So before I was talking about some of those things that would help us to reduce our own profile that we have to import. Generally we have to import most complex manufactured goods, and we tend to export simple commodities. And so the question is, well, in the environmental space, what competitive advantages do we and others have that we can work with each other on? The second one is around eco-labeling programs, the idea that in each country that is a participant to this, the labels that you look at would be consistent with each other. And so you start to develop a more global sense of consumer-facing understanding of what these things mean and what is it that I'm buying. And that also makes it easier to trade in those goods and services, because something that I label in my country that I then export to your country, where you recognize that label and can use that label, means that becomes less of a barrier to trade and actually more of an accelerant to trade in those goods and services as well. And the third one, and this perhaps may end up being the most significant part, is that the participant countries in this agreement will have to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. And that is very significant. Fossil fuel subsidies around the world equate to something on the order of 500 billion United States dollars per annum of essentially taxpayer money that's been chucked into largely the production end of fossil fuels, also some consumption as well. And the International Energy Agency estimates that if you even had a partial phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, that you'd get something like 12% of the reductions of CO2 into the atmosphere that are required to get you to within the Paris 2-degree target. So it's significant. Of course, you can then work backwards from that and say it's, the fact that we're, as a planet, continuing to subsidize fossil fuel subsidies is, of course, meaning that we're adding 12% more than we would otherwise have to if we didn't have those subsidies at all. And so, that is part of the agreement. Now, we're currently negotiating this with Fiji, Costa Rica, Norway, Iceland, and Switzerland. These are not countries with whom we have massive volumes of trade at present, and are unlikely to have huge volumes of trade within the future. But what we wanted to do with this group of countries was to actually quite quickly conclude a set of rules that other countries could then join, to say, okay, well, and actually in some ways having low trade volumes with these partners makes it easier because the stakes are lower. We can actually say, yes, we can probably agree on these set of rules, and we really want to get something quite robust, and then invite other countries who are prepared to meet those standards to join. And hopefully those will be countries with whom we have greater trade volumes, or would like greater trade volumes as well. And so I think we're feeling quite optimistic about that, and we've had some quite good early signals from other countries that they're very interested in participating. Obviously, they'll have to make their own minds up about the rule set that we agree to. But we're looking forward to some progress there. I think we've just concluded the third round of conversations on that one. So what I am hoping is that we can conclude an agreement that is really a world first, in that it is designed specifically to accelerate progress on climate change and environmental outcomes through trade, and that then becomes the gold standard for all other plurilateral, multilateral, or bilateral trade deals that are done, where people say, actually, we want to start building those kinds of measures into everything else that we do. And so I think the stakes are significant in terms of getting it right and to providing a model there for others to follow. Some of that then parallels into the negotiations that are ongoing with the United Kingdom and with the European Union, where we are, I think, have ambitions at a political level between the negotiating partners for a really gold standard set of agreements there, where those kinds of environmental and climate outcomes are reflected in the rule set that comes through. Now, they're tough negotiations, and there may be kind of other things that kind of pull against those sort of outcomes. But that is the ambition that both we and also our partners in the UK and the EU have stated at the political level that we want. and now it's, really trying to, do the hard yakka of translating that into some really quite complex and we hope quite comprehensive agreements. Now, there are some fishhooks here, and this is where some of the context of what's happening on our domestic and front when it comes to climate change and some of the way that we face into the rest of the world could backwash into those trade negotiations. In recent months, and this is where I was saying that there are some signs of recent progress around the multilateral process. So China, about a month or so ago, announced that it was going to adopt, or it has adopted a net zero carbon dioxide target for the year 2060. It's silent on other greenhouse gases, but frankly, if China can get its carbon dioxide down to net zero by 2060, that is utterly transformational. It's huge. And so it's a very, very strong signal that they've been willing to commit to that as a target, because they tend not to commit to something if they don't think that their 5-year plans between now and then can kind of get there. But also Japan, South Korea have adopted net zero all gases targets for 2050, which now means that every member of the G7 has a net zero all gases 2050 target. And now they are looking at us sideways because we do not have a net zero all gases target. We have a split gases target where we want to get our long-term gases, our stock gases of carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide down to net zero by 2050, and a reduction in our biogenic methane over time, but not down to net zero, i.e. not offsetting the difference. And so that is seen, whereas, a few years ago, a couple of years ago, when we were putting this together, we were generally considered at the front of the pack, where now people are starting to say, actually, that may not be good enough. And if you're the European Union and you've decided that you're going to have some form of carbon border adjustment, then that exposes us to risk in terms of our negotiations with them, so that our domestic target may end up being a weakness in our trade negotiations with the EU and perhaps the UK and other countries as well. Now, we would come back to them and say, you can have all the targets you like, but if you don't do anything about them, they're not worth much. And of course, we have legislated and will be legislating again in the current term to impose a price on agricultural greenhouse gases in the form of either the existing emissions trading scheme or an alternate farm level measurement, management and pricing scheme. Currently, the EU and the UK aren't intending to impose any price, but they are subsidising production. And so that's the kind of countervailing argument, which we can say, well, yes, you might have what looks like a stronger target, but we're actually doing something about it. So, maybe those two things balance each other out when it comes to the trade deals. Again, I think given that everybody knows that what we want is a comprehensive goods offer, you might start to see, what does that look like? The carbon border adjustment the EU has signalled is an interesting thing to investigate. It's at this point largely a political statement, so it doesn't have a lot of detail to it in terms of what that actually means in practice. It sort of seems to be a principle that they're applying to their relationships. And so the fact that we've got a good relationship on climate change, I think, means that we may end up being an exception to that, but we'll have to see how it plays out. And, Brazil may fall afoul of it. I see you. So, in conclusion, we can accelerate and align and accelerate climate change outcomes through our trade agreements. I think we will see further accrual of either trade advantage or disadvantage, depending on what's happening domestically. And the third thing is that it's already happening. And I think where we are is really only at the very beginning of that. And I imagine that we'll see a lot more of that over the coming months and years. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you very much, Minister Shaw, and I hope we can come back to those points you raised when we get to the Q&A. Can I now invite Frank Scimgeour to give his own perspectives?
Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Alice and Karsten. Kia ora, greetings, everyone. It's great to see you this afternoon, to be with you in these conversations over these last 2 days, really fruitful. As we talk about trade, I believe it's really important that we remember that trade is undertaken by business people, by business agents. We often assume too easily that people and businesses will change in response to our policy and legislative changes. And it seems to me that businesses interacting all the time with consumers, supply chain members, emerging technology, the responding to shocks, and interaction with government and policy is only one thing which is impacting them at any point in time. Let us remember, particularly those of us who are economic modelers, that these business agents, they are not fixed coefficients responding to regulation or price changes in predictable ways. They're much more like All Black players responding to changes mandated by World Rugby. They respond sometimes slower than we would like, and sometimes in surprising ways. So there's 3 points that I'd like to make before I put 2 questions on the table. Firstly, business needs information. Exporters need to know their products better than that they have in the past. Importers likewise need to understand their products, and this applies to services as well. This requires public and private engagement so that we have accurate, meaningful and impactful data that helps us in these processes. We don't want any more measures like food miles that muddy the water and which don't help us along the journey. The second point that I'd like to make is that business needs infrastructure. Current levels of productivity at ports of Auckland, I suggest to you, not only undermine the welfare and well-being of the provinces and some of Auckland's citizens, they also increase the carbon intensity of our imports and our exports. It's not very good at all that we make this significant backward step at a time when we're wanting to move forward. It's a critical issue which needs to be addressed. The third thing that I would put on the table is we've talked quite a lot about inclusion over the last 2 days. To me, this is an important topic, having spent part of my life and career in the Pacific, and I'm just concerned that we make sure that we empower people through our processes and policies and procedures, and that our regulations and tactics don't become a mechanism to exclude people inappropriately. Trade relationships are fragile. I finish with 2 questions. Is the ETS fit for purpose? How does it fit with our emerging trade policies? And the second one is, how is New Zealand developing the human capital that it needs for us to monitor carbon and other matters through commerce and validate the products that come our direction? Thank you very much.
Check. So, in answer to the first question, is the emissions trading scheme fit for purpose? It depends what you think the purpose is. We spent a lot of effort in the last term of government fixing the emissions trading scheme and building in settings, some of which had never been put in place in the first place, some of which were torn out of it in about 2011, which really undermined the scheme. The most significant of these settings, it's a cap and trade system, but it didn't have a cap, which it's unsurprising that in the absence of a cap, emissions continue to increase. And so it has not been fit for purpose. actually the fact that it was also designed originally to be part of a global system meant that it was globally exposed. So when the international system under Kyoto stopped, and ours didn't, we had this sort of excess of very, very cheap international units came in, some of which were fraudulent and didn't actually represent actual emissions reductions anywhere in the world, and so on. The so-called hot air scandal that was particularly hot in about 2016. So, I think we've done a huge amount to fix it. The current price is $36.50, I think, as of yesterday, which is about a 47% increase on where it was only a couple of years ago. So, that price point is starting to rise to the point where it'll become effective. It is now a domestic-only scheme, which gives us considerably more control over it, and means that actually we can actually start to use it, I think, more targeted towards reducing our own greenhouse gas emissions domestically. But because there's likely to be a need to supplement our domestic action with some form of offshore cooperation in order for us to hit our emissions reductions targets, certainly in the near term, there may be a conversation around does it link to other systems like the EU system or the California-Ontario system or others and so on, or not, or will that international cooperation be via another mechanism other than the ETS? So those questions are yet to be determined.
Thank you, Minister and Frank. My pleasure now to invite Maureen Benson-Rea to address us.
Kia ora tātou katoa, talofa lava, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate this afternoon. I just want to pick up on some of the really good points that Alice Tipping made in her presentation. As a business researcher in international business, I see that there are things that firms and consumers can do without waiting for government policy or mandated actions through policy decisions. And I think the circular economy is certainly a major and growing new approach to firm strategies around sustainability that business can take hold of, especially looking at its business models. So remember, its business models include its activities, the resources it uses, and the value proposition or offering it makes to consumers and customers. So I think the circular economy definition that Alice gave was very, very useful. But for us as individual consumers and citizens, what does that actually mean in our own personal terms? So I've just begun leading a new project on circular economy in the global sports industry, and with a particular focus on all of those products you've got at home. So the global apparel, equipment, and shoes industry is worth about $413 billion US. So what do you do with all those tennis rackets you've got in your garage, those sneakers you don't really like but you don't want to throw out? What do you do with them? We need more take-back initiatives to reuse, recycle, reprocess, refurbish, and do something to extend and maintain the life cycle of that product. So there are some great examples in the global apparel sports apparel industry. Adidas is working with Parley to develop a shoe that's made entirely from recycled ocean plastic. Reebok is developing a shoe made entirely from things that grow, a shoe that can be made from plant-based material, notably cotton and corn. So if you look at the academic literature, which of course I do, the circular economy has mostly been studied from the perspective of purely the environmental approach and increasingly looking at the social and economic dimension. But I think it's important for us to look at what firms and businesses and consumers can do in their own right. So leading into a question for you, Minister, I think that we see activist consumers, also among people who are starting new ventures, who are running businesses. Really picking up on what you said, Frank. People do business. It's people running businesses. So there are increasingly activist entrepreneurs and business people, business owners, who share the same values as our politicians, perhaps, as our consumers, as the rest of society. But how can firms and consumers generally be incentivized and enabled to build on these kinds of circular economy initiatives? So what opportunities do you see, Minister, in this wider trade and economic context to support or promote the circular economy agenda? Thank you.
So this is something that our government actually started to do some quite serious policy work in the last term. I haven't yet docked in with the responsible minister on what's coming up next, but there are definitely things that are happening here in this space around circular economy. One of which is some of you may come across or even have on your phone an app called Kogo, which is there was an organisation called Conscious Consumers, which has now evolved into Kogo, and the idea is that they can, essentially they link to your bank accounts, see what it is you're spending money on, and then tell you what your carbon footprint is as a result of an analysis of, how much petrol you're buying, or, what you're spending on energy bills, or eating out, and so on, how much you drink. Probably tell you a few other things as well. And then they're selling that data to companies as aggregated data insights. So, I think those kinds of things will become more. There's another one, Carbon Click, which is a Bitcoin application where, sorry, not Bitcoin, the other thing, where you, with every purchase that you make, you can essentially offset that the carbon associated with that purchase and so on. So those sort of things are starting to come through. I think we have quite a challenge in New Zealand because much of what we consume comes from offshore. And like I said before, we tend to import complex manufactured goods like iPhones and cars and, flat screen televisions and all that kind of stuff. And we don't manufacture very much of that stuff in New Zealand at all. And so if you think about product take back and then materials recycling and repurposing, you essentially have to reverse the value chain and work out a way to basically not just collect our waste or our unwanted products, but how to get it back to where it came from in a condition that it can then be reused and sort of turned into, get that circle going. And at the moment, from what I've seen, we've got very little, except the most rudimentary approaches to that whole challenge, and that is quite significant. But if there are any entrepreneurs in the room, you would be hearing opportunity in that.
Now open the floor to questions. If microphone over here, and if you could say your name and keep your questions short. Thank you.
Kia ora, Nalini Singh from APEC and MFAT. Thank you for your kōrero, Minister. This morning we heard about inclusive trade and particularly Indigenous trade. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the links between climate change and colonization and how addressing climate change can also help us address the challenges of colonization.
How long do I have for this?
You've got 30 seconds.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll just focus on one thing, which is one of the debates in the Paris Agreement is around historical responsibility and loss and damage. And the idea that essentially the effects of climate change are being felt in places that have been colonized, and that, essentially there are a number of developing countries that are sort of at the front line or experiencing more severe damage as a result of increased, storms, floods, fires, droughts, and so on earlier. And that's starting to, kind of backwash into not starting to, it's been a big feature of the negotiations internationally for some time. And the developed countries, the wealthier countries who have profited off the Industrial Revolution and got there first, are very resistant to, going down that path. And so, I mean, I think those, colonization and the Industrial Revolution, those are two things are linked, obviously, and so there's something in there to explore. The other one is what we call historical responsibility. So, we sort of drew a line at 1990 as a base year and said, our job is to try and reduce emissions below the 1990 base year. Of course, in New Zealand, they've gone up, as in most countries, they've gone up since 1990. But actually, if you think about the Industrial Revolution, it started quite a lot before 1990. And so there is a sort of a debate, I guess, which is unresolved, but again presents itself in the international negotiations, the extent to which the developed countries got wealthy by putting carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere, the consequences of which are being visited upon the poorer countries and communities around the world. And so, again, I think there's an unresolved set of debates there as well. Third and final thing is just that, here in Aotearoa, we have te tiriti o Waitangi responsibilities that we've had to work through into the Zero Carbon Act and into our legislation to say, well, this isn't just any country's legislation, it's ours. How do we take those obligations that are in the Paris Agreement, import them into our domestic legal framework in a way that also meets our kind of constitutional requirements?
Stephen Jacoby from the International Business Forum.
Thank you, Fran. Kia ora, Minister. Good to see you, and thank you very much for your very positive comments today. One of the things that you have been very successful in doing is creating a greater sense of bipartisanship around climate policy. And that's the sort of thing that, of course, we in business would like to see around trade policy. And so, and we have discussed this many times in the past. But I guess my question to you is, what sort of things do you think are indispensable in free trade agreements as we go forward in this next generation, such that we can deliver greater bipartisanship, and perhaps your party might be able to support these agreements more wholeheartedly?
I love that right at the very end there, given it's not been entirely wholehearted to date. But I think that's because historically we have, our assessment is that our trade negotiations have pulled in sort of centrifugal force away from where we want to be on environmental standards. And so the reason that I'm so excited about the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability is because I think finally there might be a trade deal I can vote for on the basis that it's not merely consistent, but actually really progressive. But I think actually the answer, just very briefly, is within the Trade for All agenda. I mean, there was a reason why our government set that up, and it was because we felt that the social consensus around trade was fraying, and we were representing those views, or some of those views, some of the countervailing views or the sceptical views in Parliament, and that was our job to do that. But that's not an ideal situation, right? So the ideal situation actually is that we can improve the quality of our trade deals to the point where people can see the benefits, whether they're not just economic but also social and environmental as well. And I was actually really impressed with where the Trade for All kind of program got to, and I know it wasn't easy for them because there was a huge diversity of views in that room, but that was the point. And I think the fact that they did come up with, I think, a pretty solid kind of agenda for how we want to go forward with those types of agreements in the future is a good sign.
Question over here from Tracy Epps from Chapman Tripp.
Thanks. It's a question for anyone on the panel. I was really interested in the comments that you made, Professor Benson-Rea, about fashion. And I read a report the other day that talks about the efforts in the fashion industry to make it more sustainable. But this report also talked about the fact that the sector is growing so rapidly that, efforts to make it more sustainable, sort of in one sense, are not really achieving a lot because the global impact on the planet is worsening. So it seems that that's unlikely an issue that's unique to the fashion sector. It presumably applies across a lot of other sectors where you're trading in goods. So my question is, how do we reconcile just that, what seems to be inevitable growth in trade and goods, with trying to bring together trade and climate change and lessening the impact of trade on the environment?
If I relate it to the fashion industry, the global fashion industry is seeing a movement in what's called slow fashion. You've seen big labels like Patagonia, don't buy that jacket. You don't have to keep purchasing and buying. So there are new startup firms all over the world. One of my doctoral students just interviewed 55 of them globally, who are pursuing very, very different reuse, recycling, slowing down the entire life cycle of fashion products. So it's going to change bit by bit in industries like that. I think we need to think about consumers. Not all consumers can afford to buy a new Patagonia jacket, even if it does last you a long time. So we do have to consider the impact on individual consumers and citizens too. But I'll pass over to some of my colleagues who may have.
Okay, Richard, did you have a question? Richard Harmon? Oh, well, I'll ask one anyway. Just expanding on the border adjustments and taxation that may come on board, and carbon components of, as we heard earlier in presentations. I mean, should that actually, is this something we can avoid, or is this something that's going to become a reality, do you think, Minister?
Well, I mean, the answer is I don't know. There are huge practical issues to, carbon border adjustment. I mean, one of the debates we have around the emissions trading scheme, for example, is, in the domain of steel, our steel manufacturer, the one plant that we have, is exposed at a price on carbon at the margin in ways that our competitor countries aren't, although that is also changing. So steel is coming into the Chinese ETS system and so on. So that'll start to even out over time. And in the absence of a price on production from around the world, what we do is we give free units to, the steel plant here, so that they're only paying 10% of the obligation, so it becomes a marginal, price at the margin. A bit of an incentive to shift, but not something that's going to make them uncompetitive versus steel that's produced elsewhere. Now, you could say that one way to get around that without subsidising their emissions is to impose a border adjustment on carbon steel products. But if you want to unpack every freight, shipping container that comes into the country and assess the steel content of the goods that are coming in, and then impose an adjustment on that, that's just not going to happen, right? It's not practical. And I think it's those sort of details are why the EU kind of concept is much more at the level of principle, which is, if you're playing ball on climate change, we'll do you a deal. If you're not, that's going to be an expensive deal for you. That's one where you don't have to kind of get into it, and it also means that they can kind of make an assessment country by country about how they're doing it. We, of course, would say, well, that would have to be applied evenly. Like we would want to make sure that if they were applying some kind of adjustment to us, because, like I said, if they object to the fact that we're not offsetting our residual methane inside our domestic target, then if they're doing a deal with the US or anybody else, that they're applying the same principle to those other countries as well. And it's not just a fact that, they're big and we're small that enables them to do that. But if they were doing a deal with the US, they wouldn't apply it to the same extent. So those are some of the kind of tricky issues, which I think will mean that if you are moving towards those kind of carbon border adjustments, that the evolution will be slow and uneven, because they are so complex and the issues of fairness and parity are so difficult to work through.
Frank, do you have a quick comment on that?
I'd just like to add that the same kind of challenge exists in production systems and how we attribute emissions or anything else. Imagine a sheep has a lamb and produces some wool, and how much of any measure do we attribute to the meat of the lamb, or the meat of the sheep, or to the wool, or to everything else? But it seems to me most of our modern production systems have multiple products, and it seems to me we do need to develop some frameworks and some protocols so that we can work through these things in ways that make progress, and we don't get lost in argument for 20 years.
Okay. I'll have to, at that point, wrap, I'm afraid, getting the thumbs up. Thank you very much, Minister, for sharing your insights into the developing world of climate and trade together, and particularly also the potential for another nascent New Zealand Pathfinder agreement that others can clip onto involving sustainability, climate and trade. That's really in the kind of tradition of New Zealand leadership in trade and possibly also climate. And to our two respondents, thank you for your frank comments, which actually are bedded in what the business realities are for doing trade. And I invite you all to thank the panel. Thank you. And Minister. Yeah. Thank you.